Hey there everyone, this is Samuel Johnson and welcome back to the Steven Universe Retrospectives. And today we're going to be discussing episodes 79 and 80 of Steven Universe, Super Watermelon Island, and Gem Drill. Now, once again, recap for previous episodes because we're still in the middle of a story arc. The gems were made aware by Peridot that there was a gem super weapon in the center of the Earth called the Cluster, a giant mega fusion of various gem shards that once it emerges it will destroy the Earth. So they formed an uneasy alliance with Peridot in order to work together to build a drill to get down to it and hopefully destroy it. Through the process of working with Peridot, they wound up growing closer to her until eventually she realized that she started to care about them as friends, and in the previous episodes, she did finally manage to get in contact with Yellow Diamond and promptly told her to piss off, essentially marking herself as a traitor and now officially joining the Crystal Gems. So, yeah, she's one of the good guys now, goody. But there is still the matter of the cluster to deal with, which is where these episodes pick up. Sort of. Super Watermelon Island actually focuses back in on the Watermelon Stevens, as the episode opens with Steven waking up in the body of one, and it turns out that they've set themselves up on Mask Island, that place that Steven brought Lars and Sadie. But not Connie. Connie was never there. It's the place where he brought Lars and Sadie, and then Sadie pretty much just kidnapped Lars to keep him there. But bottom line, they've set up their own little community there. They're thriving. They got watermelon animals, watermelon harvest, watermelon kids. They pretty much just got this whole thriving community, with at the center of their community being a statue dedicated to the little baby watermelon that sacrificed its life to end the fighting. So, everything seems to be going well. They're all nice. However, as Steven is touring around the place, the place is suddenly shaken by a slight tremor, and once this happens, all the watermelons suddenly stop as they have a little gong, and they all gather in the center of town, with all of them doing the not it thing where they all touch their nose. And of course, since Steven has no idea why the hell they're doing this, he's essentially the it one in this case. And what that involves is that once you're it, they paint a star on your chest and then bring you to a little cliff at the edge of the island. Of course, Steven has no idea why the hell they're doing this, so he doesn't know what the proper procedures are, but they essentially show him that once he's out there, he just has to hold his arms out and let something happen. So Steven obliges, and it turns out that this ritual is to satiate a certain beast. In this case, Malachite, as she emerges from the water, sees the watermelon Steven, and then promptly eats him, resulting in the real Steven waking up in a shudder. As such, yeah, the gems have also been sensing the tremors, and Peridot believes that this is a sign of the cluster, as a sign of it about to emerge is slight tremors, then large earthquakes, and then eventually Earth go boom. But Steven tries knocking this down and saying that he thinks it's Malachite. She's off Mask Island. As such, the Crystal Gems think that if Malachite's causing this much mayhem, then that must mean that Lapis is losing control of the fusion, and if Jasper is allowed out, well, yeah, Malachite's going to cause some serious damage. So Garnet decides that she, Amethyst, and Pearl will go to Mask Island and deal with Malachite, while Steven and Peridot stay behind and deal with the drill. So they run off, and Steven does get Peridot up to speed in between scenes, but unfortunately, though, he doesn't really know what to do, because the tremors are still happening, and so he's afraid that things are going to go wrong. But, of course, he was still ordered to be there, but on Peridot's urging, Steven managed to find a workaround for this. His mental powers. As in this case, he woke up in the body of a watermelon Steven before, maybe he could just do that again. And so, very easily, Steven just plops himself down on a blanket and managed to fall back asleep, resulting in him going once again back into the body of a watermelon Steven, a different one this time, which you actually see him enter the body this time, and the watermelon Steven whose body he inhabits is just playing hacky sack with another, and as Steven invades its body, suddenly it just seems to jerk around and fall over before it gets back up with Steven in the driver's seat. But bottom line, now that Steven's is back in a watermelon, he runs to the edge of the island towards the beach, and sure enough, yep, Lapis is losing control of Malachite, as Jasper manages to assert control and pretty much tells Lapis to knock it the hell off. They have to accept that they're this thing now, and they're not going to be separate anytime soon. As such, considering that Malachite is a giant fusion, Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl decide that they should fight fire with fire, and decide to fuse into Alexandrite. Which, excuse me a second. Sorry about that. As you saw, Chindy just came walking in, so I had to close the door. Anyway, like I said, so Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl decide to fight fire with fire and fuse once again into Alexandrite. And yeah, since the last time we saw Alexandrite, she was essentially in the situation right out of a sitcom. This time we actually get to see her in the field of battle, and guess what? She kicks major ass. And in this case, the first thing that Alexandrite does is that she tells Malachite that maybe she should give up, that they don't have to fight, and well, she's outnumbered. It's 3-on-2. But Malachite just pretty much tells them, you know what? No, I'm not going to do that. And Jasper from within even tells Lapis, if we're going to be this thing, let's at least have some fun. Which leads to, honestly, a really kick-ass fight scene between Alexandrite and Malachite, and it's genuinely awesome. You actually get to see Alexandrite in battle, and despite her being a very large fusion, she's very agile, very strong. She combines the moves of all the various gems, showcasing the strength, the acrobatics, the fortitude of all of them. And what makes it even better, Alexandrite can use all the weapons of all the gems that have make her up. Not just Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl, but also the weapons of their respective fusions. Like, she can use Sugalite's mace, she can use Opal's bow and arrow, she can use Sardonyx's giant hammer. It's honestly really damn cool. We get to see more of her powers again. It turns out she has fire breath that she can shoot out of her second mouth. And what makes it even better, you can actually see Malachite in action. And yeah, you can just see the full extent of Lapis's powers combined with Jasper's. As Jasper turns her aquakinesis into raw strength, especially considering that they're fighting in the ocean, which is essentially Lapis's element. She's able to create giant fish. She's able to turn it into ice. She's able to take little droplets of water, turn them into spears to throw them around. She's able to create giant shields that she can immediately freeze and knock back. She can fly through the air, summon Jasper's helmet, which she uses to headbutt Alexandrite and fly through, and she even managed to roll around, turn into Jasper's roll thing and knock out Alexandrite down. It's just an honest-to-God badass fight scene, and it speaks to the little boy in me that craves violence. I love it. I love it so. Excuse me again. Sorry about that again, puppy stuff. But anyway, yeah. While the fight scene is badass, sadly, Alexandrite is really out of her element because, well, the thing is, Malachite combines at this moment, is combining the two greatest strengths of the gems that make her up. Jasper, since she's clearly the one in the driver's seat, is utilizing all of her fighting prowess to easily whoop the gems' asses, and considering that she is also combining the full strength of Lapis Lazuli, who has aquakinesis, and as we've seen in previous episodes, that allows her to pretty much control any body of water, no matter how big. Yeah, the fact they're fighting in the ocean showcases that they're clearly outmatched, so combine the strengths of both of those gems into one giant fusion. Well, yeah, they're going to be outclassed despite the superior numbers in Alexandrite's part. So, yeah, Alexandrite's getting her ass whooped. As such, Steven, who's still watching on the sidelines, realizes he needs to do something, but since he's in a watermelon, he can't really utilize the full extent of his abilities. As such, he runs off back to the town to see if he can find help, and he just really finds the watermelon Steven's just cowering. As such, Steven manages to rally them in a kind of weird scene, because as a watermelon, he can't actually talk, he can just make grunting noises. But it's enough to rouse the watermelons into actually doing something, so they end up forming a little army to try and go and help Alexandrite take down Malachite. And it comes at the right time as Malachite managed to get Alexandrite in a giant grip with water hands, as Jasper from within is just talking about, yeah, you're right. You know what? I used to it's like, you're right. Fusion isn't just a cheap trick to make weak gems feel stronger. It's something more. It's something greater. I have you to thank for that. Allow me to thank you. At which point she begins trying to freeze the water hands that are holding Alexandrite in place. But before she can actually finish the job, the watermelon Stevens arrive, and they start inconveniencing her. They start throwing spears at her, which she just brushes off. They start throwing rocks at her, which hurt like hell, especially in the face. They start catapulting themselves onto Malachite's face and start bopping her in the eyes, which, yeah, I don't care how strong you are. Getting smacked in the eyes is going to hurt like hell. And eventually they even start dive bombing her, but she still managed to throw them aside and even destroy a few of them. Thankfully, though, this does distract Malachite long enough for Alexandrite to get free from the Water Hands, and it allows her to essentially go in for the kill, as it were, as she manages to run in and start beating down Malachite and even getting a few good hits in. As a result, they end up managing to knock Malachite, they even manage to knock Malachite into the air as she which she manages to stop by flying, but sadly she is now more out of her element than she was before, and it allows the gems to land on the coup de grace themselves as Alexandrite forms Opal's bow and manages to land a direct hit right on Malachite, causing her entire form to explode in a poof of light, and finally separating Jasper and Lapis, who both end up falling to the earth unconscious, and Alexandrite catching them before they hit the ground. As such, Alexandrite carries them back to the beach. The gems finally unfuse after an exhausting battle. Steven runs up to them and gives him a hug. They realize it's him in there, and they thank him for the assist, as well as the Watermelon Stevens, who also helped them. So, all's well that ends well, right? Lapis is saved, Malachite stopped, everything's good, right? Not really. It turns out, actually, after they stop Malachite, the tremors continue and start getting worse, as suddenly the earth begins to crack, which unfortunately also causes them to lose Jasper, as the earth shifts enough for her that she ends up rolling into the crack. So, that's a loose thread that they can deal with later. But put simply, yeah, it turns out Peridot wasn't wrong. The tremors actually were a sign of the cluster getting ready to emerge. So, and unfortunately, the gems are kind of stuck on Mask Island, as during the battle with Malachite, the warp was crushed. So unfortunately, by the time the gems find a new warp, it'll be too late. So they're tasking Steven with the task of helping Peridot stop the cluster. And while Steven clearly feels like he's a little out of his element, the gems pretty much tell him he's got this, he can do it, and they wish him well wishes before Steven wakes up, and that's where the episode ends, with Gem Drill picking up immediately after, as Steven wakes up back at the barn and finds the whole place just shaking with just cracks in the earth forming around him. As such, he runs up to Peridot and she begins asking where the hell the other gems are, but Steven tells them that they're stuck on Mask Island, so unfortunately, this is up to them. Peridot is a little dubious of this, but, well, sadly, she's got to work with what she's got. As such, she and Steven end up piling into the drill, which, funny thing, because the control module for the drill was Peridot's escape pod, it's incredibly cramped in there, and even Steven asks how Peridot was expecting everyone to fit inside, and Peridot just says, I don't know, maybe they'd shrink or something. But point is, they get inside the drill cockpit and manage to drill their way into the Earth, which I'm guessing they jump around. They do a few jump aheads because Peridot says it'll be 2 hours before they reach the cluster. So, they got time to kill. And it was even funnier is that Peridot puts on elevator music while they're going down, so that's funny. But it also allows Steven and Peridot to actually start talking, and what I like is that as they're going down, they end up hitting a layer of the Earth's core, which is supposed to I want to say it's a type of magma. It's I don't know. It's the same substance that Peridots are made from, and so when they see it, Steven begins asking Peridot, well, what was it like being born? And Peridot just says, I don't know. I don't know. First I didn't exist, then I was. I don't have any memories of it, just feelings, which it's kind of accurate. But bottom line, she also talks about how, despite the kind of her situation and her status as a traitor, she still feels some connection towards her homeworld. That, yeah, she's turned against them now, but you can't help but feel some form of attachment towards where you came from, which actually is some nice little bits of character development and does help showcase more of what Peridot's going through now that she's kind of officially given her homeworld the screw you. Because, well, this is a planet that she's known for most of her life. She's dedicated her life to serving it, but now she's on the opposite side. She is, by doing what she's doing right now and even defying Yellow Diamond, she's effectively turned her back on her homeworld, which, yes, it's a decision that she was willing to make, and even she states that that it's fine that she has other things that she's willing to fight for, such as the case of Steven and the Crystal Gems, who she's now calling friends. At the very least, you can what I like is that there is still some fallout from it. That despite her status being an ally, there's still some there's still excess, I guess, if that makes any sense. I feel like it's the wrong word. I feel like it is the wrong word. It is the wrong word. It's just that there's baggage. There's still baggage. Yes, she's willing to defend the Earth now, but it's a big decision to have to pretty much just say screw you to the place that you called your home for so long. And it's clear that while Peridot is willing to still help the Crystal Gems, it's her mind is still a little boggled. She's not going to go back on what she did, but at the same time, it's a nice little thing that showcases that just showcases her feelings, and that despite her newfound situation, there's still going to be a part of her that misses being on homeworld. So I like that. Again, excuse me a second. Again, puppy stuff. But anyway, that bit of character development with Pound Peridot's part is kind of pushed aside as they're drilling through some more gem mutants. It turns out there are some more gem mutants. It turns out that it looks like a few were buried with the cluster. As such, Peridot ends up pulling out the weapon system, which, funny thing, apparently Pearl was against putting weapons on, but Peridot thought that such a thing was stupid, so she installed them anyway, and guess what? The controller for the weapons is an N64 controller. As someone whose first console was an N64, I love that. But point is, Steven ends up using it to blast the gem mutants, but he ends up feeling a little guilty because even if he destroys them now, they'll just reform later and just be nuts. He thinks maybe we can bubble them, but Peridot says that there's nothing they can really do for them, because at the end of the day, they're just shards. Yeah, they're stuck together, but she kind of talks more about how shards operate, that shards do have some form of a consciousness, but it's limited, if it makes any sense. Essentially, they have no idea where they are or what they're doing. They just have a preternatural need to seek out the other parts of themselves so they can reform, and, well, as a result, there's no real way you can help them. It's just a matter of taking care of them, poofing them, because at this point, there's really no way you can find all the spare pieces, and so really the mercy is just to poof them and move on. So yeah, that's kind of sad when you think about it, but they managed to fend off enough of the gem mutants that they're able to reach the cluster. And yeah, it's kind of a sight to see so many gem shards in one place, but it looks like Steven and Peridot are too little too late, as the cluster seems to start glowing and looks like they're ready to form. So Steven and Peridot start freaking out as they think, oh shit, we've lost, it's gonna form. But just as the cluster seems to try to actually form a shape, it seems to settle a little, as it still glows, and you can see like a mass of limbs just kind of flailing about from it. Then what I like is that this kind of showcase that this isn't that the cluster hasn't actually formed yet, but is getting to that. They look like phantoms, like ghosts. Like the bodies are not at this point. They're not hard light yet. They're just light. They're just images, so things can still pierce through them. They're see-through. They're not tangible. I like that. And it actually does add like a little spooky flair to the cluster. The point is, it hasn't fully formed yet, so Peridot thinks they have a chance. As such, she once more reactivates the drill and starts charging straight for the cluster head on. But sadly, even in its ghostly state, the cluster is still resisting. And while they do manage to reach the gem shards themselves, sadly the resistance is again proving too much, as one by one the drills that they have on it, which apparently are 3, I don't get it, but whatever, maybe they could have separated the one drill into 3, begin falling off one by one. However, through the whole thing, Steven seems to be reacting negatively, as the more they drill closer in, the more Steven seems to just be in pain. At first he just chalks it up maybe to the noise just getting to him, but it's more physical, as he begins grabbing his head and just squinting in pain. He's clutching his chest, going nuts. And we soon see that this isn't just nerves kicking in. It's his gem power, specifically the mental / empathic powers, maybe. Well, Haley would probably say mental, but whatever. Point is, his gem is glowing, and Peridot sees him freaking out and wants to try and calm him down, saying, "Steven, are you okay? What's going on?" Well, Steven starts seeing ghostly images surrounding him. Just looks like people crying out in pain, and as they start getting more prevalent, eventually Steven stops seeing Peridot or the drill at all, as his seat is just now in the midst of these ghostly images before he just loses that completely, and is now just floating in what looks like this weird black void with voices all around him. Steven begins wondering what the hell's going on, but as he looks around, it turns out he's not alone here, as across the black void are little gem shards. And that's when Steven puts 2 and 2 together. He's in the mind of the cluster. And unfortunately, the gem shards are reacting the way that Peridot said. they're trying to find their other parts. They're just constantly saying, we want to, it's like, we want to, we need to, we have to form. And it's just becoming an obsessive thing. And Steven, when he realizes he's in the cluster's head, does try pleading with them not to form, that they can't form. They're just going to destroy the Earth if they do. And while the cluster is a bit adamant that it wants to form, well, when the shards do hear that them forming will destroy the Earth, they start being a little bit more reluctant, because apparently these are all crystal gem shards, so I guess they don't want to destroy the Earth. But pretty much, using what Peridot told him, Steven realized that he thinks the best way to get the cluster to stop is that since it wants to find its other parts, because it says if it forms it can become whole, well, why not just talk to each other? After all, they're all gem shards. Maybe if they connected with each other, they wouldn't need to form. And to showcase this, he introduces two little shards together, and just one by one, the shards actually start talking into each other and start introducing themselves as they actually start reaching out to one another. And they start realizing, maybe we don't need to form. We can form connections here, so everything looks hunky-dory, right? Well, unfortunately, the instant that the cluster starts trying to get a form, it's sadly a process that can't just be turned off, because unfortunately the cluster is still trying to form. And unfortunately, it's not so. And despite the gem shards trying to stop it, yeah, it's gonna happen either way. However, Steven thinks that maybe if he can bubble all the gems, they won't actually form, right? Well, unfortunately, he's a kid in the midst of possibly hundreds of thousands of gem shards. He can't bubble them all, so sadly, after maybe bubbling like 5, he gets booted out of the cluster's mind because, well, there's nothing he can really do. As such, he wakes back up in the drill, and he does scream that he can't, that the cluster doesn't want to form, but he doesn't know what to do. That is until bubbles start popping up around the cluster. Yet somehow, I don't get how, the gem shards are actually able to bubble each other. As such, Steven, when he sees this, ends up reaching his hands to the floor and begins pleading with them, saying, you can do it, we can do it, we can do this together! And he managed to put his extra oomph into it, and with Steven's extra little push, all the bubbles start form into one giant one that completely covers the cluster. Excuse me again. Sorry about that again, puppy stuff. Anyway, like I said, Steven and the gem shards managed to bubble the cluster. So yeah, they managed to finally stop it. As such, with that in mind, Steven and Peridot managed to make their way back to the surface, as apparently the Jill has little legs on it that allow it to climb up the shaft that they make, and the tremors have now stopped since the cluster isn't forming anymore. And as Peridot and Steven get out of the drill, the gems finally manage to pour back in, carrying an unconscious lapis lazuli. As such, they begin asking what's going on, and Steven managed to give them the update that they managed to stop the cluster. It's not that it hasn't been destroyed. They've managed that it didn't actually want to form, and it didn't actually want to destroy the Earth. So Steven says that now they have plenty of time to get to know each other now that they've been bubbled. Which even when Pearl hears that, she's like, "How did you manage to bubble that whole thing?" But I forget what Steven responds with, but the episode ends with the camera panning down to the giant bubble in the center of the Earth that is the cluster. So yeah, that's how that story arc ends. So, okay, what did I think of these episodes? Well, for starters, Super Watermelon Island, I think it's a good setup for Gem Drill, but also acts as a nice little catalyst to not a catalyst, but as a way of putting of ending the Malachite storyline. What I think does well is that it's kind of half filler. It's like 1/3 filler, 1/3 conclusion story arc, 1/3 setup for the finale of the cluster story arc. Because in this case, again, hold on one second. Like I said, in this case, what kind of helps it work in all 3 categories is that it's filler in the sense that it's distracting from the plot with the cluster. As we get to check back in with the Watermelon Stevens and learn they have a little society that Steven has to go in, intervene with, and kind of hype them up so that they can help with a bigger threat. What helps, and how it acts as a finale to the Malachite storyline is that we actually get to see Malachite get taken care of. Malachite is finally defeated. We see the gems actually, it works well in that regard because we finally get to see the gems clash with Malachite. And yeah, like I said, it's a really badass finale for that one. As we see the gems actually as we see the gems clashing with Malachite, and we actually get to see Alexandrite in full battle, and it's awesome. Like really, damn awesome seeing Alexandrite utilize the full extent of her abilities and showcasing just how capable a gem made of a fusion made of 3 gems, or 4 in this case, can really do. As we see that Alexandrite combines the strengths of all the gems that make her up, as well as their abilities, weapons, and of course some new abilities of her own, like the fucking fire breath. That's awesome. But Malachite, what makes it better too is that we now see Malachite in full view. Like the whole time, like the first time we saw Malachite, we got an imposing aura from her, but that kind of got thrown out. Kind of got thrown out the window as after all, Lapis only agreed to the fusion so she could trap Jasper. So for that part, we kind of just saw her get dragged away. But then the next time you saw Malachite was when Steven entered Malachite's mind and spoke with Lapis. And then the last thing we saw was Malachite telling him to piss off. So you can still get like an imposing aura here. Well, this time, now that Jasper's managed to wrench free of Lapis and managed to gain control of the fusion, well, we see her kicking ass with it. And yeah, she's the bad guy, but oh my god, the power that Malachite has is awesome. Seeing her utilize Lapis's powers on such a scale, being able to turn water into ice, turn it into a weapon to fly, actually being able to combine all the aspects of Lapis and Jasper that can work well in battle, and just going nuts with it. And I think what I like better is, again, her villainous speech when she looks like she's winning against Alexandrite, when Malachite talks about how, you know what, you're right, fusion is awesome. I see that now because I'm whooping your ass. It's actually really nice and really does put a cap on things. And when she's finally taken down, it really does feel like everything's kind of come to a head in that regard. That they finally managed to save Lapis and Malachite's been stopped. It really does work in that regard. But how it also works in creating build-up for Gem Drill is that it showcases that despite them getting such a big the gems achieving such a big victory and defeating Malachite, saving Lapis and all that, well, that turns out that the bigger threat is still all over the horizon. Yes, they've saved a friend, but unfortunately the cluster is still a thing, and they realize it's about to emerge, and since the gems had to go and deal with Malachite, they can't come back right away, especially, like I said, since in the battle the warp pad was destroyed. So in that regard, it still sets the foundation and it kind of helps put the pieces in place. That Steven and Peridot, who are, let's be honest, at this point the weakest members of the team, have to now go and deal with this. Yes, Peridot has more experience in the field than Steven, but at the very least, she doesn't have any extra abilities at the moment. She has a higher intellect, and she's more resilient than other gems. Otherwise, from her perspective, at this point, she thinks she's pretty useless, so all she really has is the drill. And so it really does lay the foundation that, yeah, they're kind of on their own, but there's really nothing they can do. They have to deal with it as it is. And so you can kind of feel the pressure building up, so to speak, and that it was an unintentional pun. I feel sick for making it. But bottom line, you can see the pressure building up, but you realize you have no choice in that regard. You have to deal with it. So I love that. I like seeing that come together. Made even better because of the Malachite defeat. You got this big victory, but it's overshadowed by this bigger thing coming up. So I like that. And again, adding on seeing the Watermelon Stevens and seeing how that kind of comes back to a head, and it really does lead to an actually interesting episode that managed to combine these 3 different storytelling aspects into a cohesive whole that I think makes for an interesting episode that is just beyond fucking awesome. When I first saw the episode and saw the fight, I thought, holy shit, this is just damn amazing. And when it finally ended, I was like, oh, I gotta tweet about this. So yeah, overall, Super Watermelon Island I think is a good start. Again, sorry about that. Shindy's kind of getting stir crazy. Excuse me a sec. Again. So anyway, but like I said, the ending of Super Watermelon does lead well into Gem Drill. And in the case of Gem Drill, I think what works for this episode is the anticipation. It starts strong as Steven and Peridot are just kind of alone at the barn as the tremors begin picking up. And as they drill down. But from there, you get more quiet moments, and exemplified by the humor especially with Peridot turning on the elevator music. That was actually funny. But what makes it work is that it's now just Steven and Peridot in an enclosed space as they're getting closer and closer to the target, the thing they've been working so hard to get to. But even here, they don't really know what they're going to do when they get there. Even when Steven asks Peridot what's the plan, she just says, we have a drill, we're just going to drill. Like, it's clear that they don't know what they're doing. They just have a drill, so they're just going to use it. So they really have no, so they're kind of just going in blind, and it really works well in creating a sense of unease because you kind of realize that they may have just come so far only to fail. So it really does well. It does well in adding tension, especially when, as they get closer, they start encountering problems with the gem mutants, and then when they finally do reach the cluster once again, it looks like they might have failed, and they're just shy of the cluster forming. And so when tension starts picking up again, it's really like you realize because when Peridot starts upping the ante on the drill, yeah, it's becoming, and in fact, it's becoming clear that this is probably still a failing battle, especially since the drill doesn't seem to be doing anything to the cluster. But in the meantime, you see Steven freaking out and start losing it. But the way Steven ends it is also, again, interesting. It's a Steven way to end it. In a way, it can feel unsatisfying because unlike the Malachite stuff, there is no big clash between Steven and the cluster. But for me, what makes it interesting is that it is a Steven way of ending the conflict, as he ends the conflict not by trying to destroy the cluster, but by talking with it, much like what he did with Lapis. Like, because going back with Lapis, how he stopped Lapis's threat when she tried stealing the ocean, he actually just talked to her and listened, and then offered aid, which in turn offered aid, and that in turn resulted in her essentially listening to him, accepting the help, and by doing that, it ended the threat. And then likewise, the same is true with the cluster. Or better yet, let's go with another example with Peridot. Peridot was an enemy of the crystal gems, but Steven offered her a hand of friendship, and from that hand, she began offering them more advice. They grew closer, and now she's a full-fledged ally. So it showcases that this is part of how Steven works. He doesn't end a fight. It kind of goes. How he ends a fight is with the Wonder Woman method. And he doesn't end a fight by trying to strike the opponent down. He wants to end a fight by offering a hand of friendship. And that's kind of what he does when he realizes he's in the cluster's mind, because this gives him an opportunity to actually talk to the cluster and try to negotiate, to try and reason with it. And from talking with it, he begins learning more about what's really going through its proverbial head and what's driving it to want to form. And this allows Steven to begin kind of actually reasoning with it, bargaining with it, and eventually coming to a compromise that they don't have to form because they've got plenty of company with each other. And especially helps that the cluster genuinely did not want to destroy the Earth. It was more forming because it felt it had to. And then by the time it realized, oh, I don't have to, well, it had already started forming, so at that point you can't really stop it unless there's some other Deus Ex Machina interference. So I do like that. It's more cheesy and heartfelt, but it is kind of sweet seeing Steven actually talk to the cluster and essentially stop it by just convincing it to not form. By just saying, look, you have each other here, why don't you just stay here and get to know each other? And that's what happens. The cluster decides that it's more content staying where it is and just being in a bubble, letting all the gem shards get to know one another and form its own little community. I like that. I do like that. It's not as epic as the conclusion with Malachite, which, yeah, my inner little boy kind of groaned a little at that, especially since we just had that kick-ass fight scene between Alexandrite and Malachite. But at the same time, it does feel really nice seeing Steven end the conflict by just talking. It's just nice, and it is I do kind of like seeing that more in cartoons. That sometimes you don't have to end a fight, you don't have to end a conflict by throwing fisticuffs. That sometimes it is nice to just sit down and talk. So I like that. I do like that. It's, again, not as epic as it could have been, especially since considering how they built up the cluster big time in the previous episodes. We're talking about how it was a gem super weapon, it would destroy the planet, and even in the build up to this episode, you're expecting something grand, especially when you saw the cluster almost forming. But at the very least, it does feel like a very Steven thing to do, and does fit very well into his character. So I'll give it credit. That personally, well, I liked Super Watermelon Island more. That was mostly because I love the fight scene and seeing the Alexandra go against Malachite. But Gem Drill, I think, is still a good episode, and I think it does put a satisfactory cap on the storyline with the cluster, as well as actually giving us some good character stuff via Peridot. As like I said, this is still fresh off her turning over to the side of the crystal gems, so you can still see that despite her. So you can see how such the choice is still affecting her. That yeah, she's not in the middle of her freak out like we saw in Log Date 7152, but at the very least, it's clear that she still is trying to come to terms with she's still coming to terms with her new reality that she is most likely never going to see her homeworld again. Which we've seen stuff like that with the crystal gems themselves, because well, when they chose to rebel the way they did, and especially with what happened with the Gem War, it kind of ensured that they would never be able to go home. And that was a sacrifice they all had to choose to make. And it wasn't a choice they made lightly, but it's a choice they did willingly. And you can see how that, and you saw how that affected them in different regards. Like with Pearl, how she was content living with Rose, how with Garnet, how Ruby and Sapphire had to give up everything they were just to be able to exist with one another. Amethyst, well, Amethyst existed on Earth anyway, so that's not really a thing. But in this case, now you're seeing it with Peridot. She was sent to Earth to check on the cluster and let it die. When she encountered the crystal gems, she saw them as a nuisance, pests that were getting in the way of her work that she had to take care of if she wanted to do that work. But then the more she got to know them, the more she began to trust them, the more she began to like them, and the more she didn't want to see them get hurt. The more she actually started to care about the Earth as she saw more things about it, more things that caught her attention, which I actually really do like. To talk about Peridot's character arc here, one of the things that I like about her character arc is how they reach her. Peridot is a gem driven by knowledge, by understanding the unknown, by a scientific principle. And when she first encounters the gem, she sees no inherent value in any of the Earth. It's just it exists. There's no real purpose to it. It's there. It's got a thing in it she needs to look up. That's all. But what makes it better is that her views are not only challenged, but she sees things that she doesn't expect, and she gets curious about it. She begins wanting to learn more, and from that curiosity comes her trying to understand things. The more she understands them, the more she starts appreciating them. And that's more the case, and that's how it kind of worked with her bonding with the crystal gems. When she first met Steven, he explained something to her she did not understand, and she actually realized there's more value to this kid than I gave him credit for, especially since he's the only one of the gems who actually talked with him. With Pearl, Pearl challenged Peridot's preconceptions of what a Pearl could be, with her actually being very competent on her own and standing up to her. And seeing that despite her losing in her contest with Peridot, she was still rewarded. Peridot sought to understand that and realized there's more to you than there is. There's more to you than I thought, and I'd like to know, and I respect that. The same goes with Amethyst. When she saw Amethyst, Amethyst was not who she thought, but she began to slowly respect her and understand her, and especially in the case with Garnet, as when we saw in Log Date 7152, how she bonded with Garnet was through understanding, by wanting to know more about her, and thus by trying to know more about her, she got to know her more and got a better understanding of her as a person, and as a result, she began forming a connection with her as well. I like that. It's how she grew. It's how she grew to appreciate the Earth. She saw things she didn't understand but wanted to know more. And the more she knew, the more she appreciated it. The more she actually started thinking, I like it here. I like what I see here, and I like what I'm doing here. And that's what ultimately leads to her leading to her wanting to betray Yellow Diamond. And even it's exemplified here in Gem Drill, when even though she's lamenting that she can't go back home, there's still things here that she's willing to fight for. She's made new friends here. She's gone through new experiences here. Even by the end, when it looks like the cluster is about to form, she's just clutching Steven. She's just saying, "I'm sorry I couldn't save you and all the other billions of life forms who I care about significantly less." Which I love that. I love how even when she's one of the good guys, she's still an arrogant piece of shit. I love it. So I do enjoy that, but it also still showcases just the mindset of what it just kind of helps showcase more to Peridot's mindset, and what helps, and that little bit of remorse and thinking does do well in meshing with her character, and still fit with the whole I just betray my homeworld, but I still have some. I may have lost that, but I gained something that I also care for. I like that. It's really nice. It's sweet, and it does. I think it also helps kind of add more to her character arc. So yeah, overall, Super Watermelon Island was a good episode. Was a really good episode in my opinion. Like I said, it combined filler and two character arcs into one cohesive whole that still felt complete and entertaining. And while I like Gem Drill a little bit less than Super Watermelon Island, that's mostly because I liked the fight scene in Super Watermelon Island. Gem Drill, I think, is still a satisfactory ending to the cluster storyline, especially in the build up, the quiet moments, the character interactions, the Steven finally having the confrontation, and him just finally settling it, not with a bang, but with a whimper. It's nice, and I like it. So yeah, overall both good episodes. Super Watermelon kicks ass, and Gem Drill is a satisfactory ending to the cluster stuff. So yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you for watching. I'm Samuel Johnson, and we'll see you next week as we deal with a bit of the epilogue. So till then, hope you have a good night and take care.